Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'm sorry to say that Robert Coles was unable to join us at the last minute due to an urgent personal problem, but he sent his apologies, and David Elwood will later read a message that he sent for the occasion. Tonight's event is very much in keeping with the Kennedy School's mission of fostering leadership and excellence in public service. I'm happy to say that both Harvard and the Kennedy School have a long tradition of promoting public service. Phillips Brooks House in the Yard is a model of effective social service in a college community with dozens of programs and thousands of participants. In fact, I think Judith Kidd, who is the Associate Dean of Harvard College for Public Service, told me this evening, or told us this evening, that at any one time, about 1,700 Harvard students are doing public service, and during the course of their 4 years, something like 2/3 of all Harvard students do public service. I wonder if I could ask Judith, who is here in the audience tonight, if she would just stand. Here at the Kennedy School, we also have myriad opportunities for public service among faculty, staff, and students. The Office of Community and Public Service and the Community Service Network organize the efforts of Kennedy School community throughout the year. Among the most notable of the programs in which the school participates are the Graham and Parks School Program, as well as the Dorchester School Program. Students have the opportunity to explore topics that are related to the curriculum, as well as through public service, whether it's through Marshall Gans's class on organizing people, power, and change, or David Elwood's course on poverty and public policy. In fact, many effective pieces of important public policy come from citizen-initiated efforts such as the two we are going to honor tonight. But at this point, I'd like to turn it over to David Elwood to make the introductions of our two recipients of the Gleitsman Awards this evening. David.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm the academic dean, and I do believe, interestingly enough, to give you a sense of how important this occasion is, this, I believe, is the first time Joe and I have been on the same program in the forum since he arrived as dean, actually ever. So it really is an incredible honor to be a part of this whole thing. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce this year's winners. And before doing so, I'd like to say a couple of words. First of all, I'd like to read something that Robert Coles sent. He is very sad to not be able to be here, but he did want to pass along a story which comes from his book, The Call of Service, and I'll read a portion of that, and I think it's particularly useful for this setting. He said, "One day I was sitting outside a rural school near Leon, Nicaragua, talking to a Georgetown University student who was working with a Jesuit-sponsored project that built and staffed schools in third world countries. He, the Georgetown University student, said, 'I've got 4 more years here, and when I leave, that's when I'll be starting to figure out what all this has meant. Probably I'll think about it for the rest of my life, and I'll be influenced by what happened to me here. I now think differently. I agree it could wear off later, but I doubt it. Some of the kids have taught me 1,000,000 times more than I've taught them. Of course it could happen, and maybe I'll start again in the rat race, and my memory will take the rear seat while the greed grabs the wheel and steps on the gas.'" At that point, then, in this passage, Robert Coles comments that the children he was teaching and that I was interviewing made clear to me just how important he was in their lives. He shared with them openly the moral ambiguities that pressed upon him as he contemplated his future, and they had plenty to say to him in response. These empathetic boys and girls were quite willing to step into his shoes to try and imagine what they might do given his choices. One afternoon I listened to those children and their teachers discuss the nation's civil war, and as I heard them worry about people who had lost family members and heard them try to connect the teachings of the Jesuits to the proclaimed pieties of the Revolution, I began to realize that the volunteer teacher was truly one of his students, even though at moments they placed him on a pedestal. Now, to some extent, says Robert Coles, all those called to social and political activism struggle with that obvious tension between the desire to change the situation and the necessary respect for those who have had to endure the hardship and have learned to survive the best they can, and who have a hard-earned skepticism of outsiders, whatever their good intentions. The activist who stays the course longest seems to have figured out how far they can go in prodding others, how deep within themselves they must look. They have a mixture of political insistence and introspective tentativeness that allows them to be effective in spite of their ever-present frustrations. He says congratulations to Tanya Tall and to Geraldine Jensen for their leadership and achievement, and to Alan Gleitsman for his brave vision in establishing such a generous award for what is an often unrewarded task, and to the Kennedy School for its deepening commitment to the call of service and the idealism of so many students. I would just like to add a couple things to some of those thoughts. You know, in some ways, it's very hard to be an activist, and but for some kinds of activism, it isn't so hard. It's easy to get up for a month or a week or a year. It's easy sometimes to loudly voice objections to real or perceived injustices. But there's a certain kind of person that really changes the world. And that's the kind of activist that does all those things at times, but has a vision and yet a real ability to listen. It's someone who knows how to become an insider in multiple worlds and at the same time becomes an outsider in multiple worlds. They're tough and forceful, and at times they can be a real pain. And I'll say a little bit more about Jerry and my relationship on that score. Yet they're quick to work with any people that can help. They're quick to do something, even with people who don't share an identical vision. And ultimately, they have that rare quality, those rare qualities of optimism, stubbornness, idealism, vision, perseverance, and dedication that ultimately prove what we all like to believe, which is that one person really can make a difference. They are the inspiration for much of us. With that, let me turn to introducing the first recipient, and that is Tanya Tall. Now, Tanya Tall's resume is extraordinary. She and Jerry share one quality in common, many qualities in common, but one of them was that one of the first events that started them on their lives was a period of being a single parent where everything seemed to fall apart. And from that turmoil came both an understanding and also a drive that ultimately led to, I think, some of their final life. Tanya's been a champion for homeless families, developing new methodologies to combat chronic poverty, but ultimately working towards systemic change. She started Para los Niños. Now it has like 50 employees, an operating budget of $2 million, currently serving 1,000 homeless families and transient families per year in the Skid Row area. She also founded Beyond Shelter in 1988 rather, a nonprofit housing and development corporation, and it's now placed over 750 families in the Los Angeles area and scores around the country to live in stable lives. She's worked with she's a co-founder of the LA Housing Corporation, which is the originator of the service-enriched housing concept, through which the provision of social agencies to tenants help them find permanent agencies. And she conceived of and developed a nonprofit housing agency to develop affordable permanent housing for chronically mentally ill patients in LA County called the Community of Friends. All these share in common both a sense of vision, a sense of commitment, but also a goal of helping people move forward with their lives. For this and many other things, we are enormously grateful. She's worked with various administrations, including this one. And so with that, I want to introduce Tanya Tall. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In December 1966, almost 30 years ago, I applied for welfare. I was 23 years old and a college graduate. I also had a newborn baby boy and a husband who was new to this country and unemployed. We had moved to Los Angeles seeking work for him, but nothing had materialized. Our money was gone and we had exhausted all of our resources. We were hungry, frightened, and embarrassed, and the rent was due. In desperation, we entered the welfare office in West LA and applied for welfare and immediately qualified. We received a welfare check for 3 months. During that time, I learned that LA County was hiring college graduates and providing them with on-the-job training to be social workers. Needless to say, I jumped at the chance to work, and I applied and was hired within 30 days. In March 1967, I began training, and by May, I was assigned to South Central LA with a caseload of 60 AFDC mothers in my care. Our nightmare was over, but I have never forgotten how I felt the helplessness, bewilderment, and feelings of despair. I was a college graduate from a middle-class background, yet over a relatively short period of time, my life had fallen apart. I have never forgotten how I felt as that happened, and I never will. My life work eventually was directed by those feelings. If things could go so desperately wrong for me, then how much more wrong can they go for those who did not have the opportunities and education that I had? I worked for LA County for approximately 3 years, most of that time after my marriage ended, as a single mother with no child support and no alimony. Although working full-time at a fairly decent job, after paying for child care, I could barely make it each month. As the years passed, however, my life circumstances improved greatly. For most of the people in my caseloads, however, their life circumstances did not. Working that first year in South Central LA, just after the Watts riots, I felt deeply the sense of hopelessness that pervaded the homes that I visited. And I developed a great admiration for the strength and heroism of mothers who were raising their children in such adverse conditions. And young idealist that I was, I felt angry at society in general, that nobody seemed to care. Soon, however, I was transferred out of South Central LA to the Skid Row area to work this time with recently released mental patients who were being moved into the city in the thousands as the state mental institutions were closed. By 1971, I gave notice, completely and totally frustrated at my inability to help people caught up in a system that was, by its very nature, geared to keeping them down. It had become apparent to me that government often doesn't know what it is doing, nor does it sometimes really care. These early experiences, however, would impact greatly on my work later on. I entered UCLA Graduate School of Education, taught for a short while, and then remarried, spent a few years raising my 2 young daughters in addition to my older son. There was deep within me, however, during this time, a feeling that something was missing, that there was something that I was supposed to do, but I did not know what it was. And now let me go back to 1979. Every evening that year, there was constant coverage on TV of the genocide and starvation in Cambodia. This followed a year of constant coverage of famine in Biafra. I was feeling concern about the great suffering in the world and felt totally helpless at the same time. I wanted to do something. But the reality was that there was nothing that I could do. One woman alone, I know we all feel like this at times. So I would turn off the TV and eventually fall off to sleep, and the next morning the sun would rise and everything would be back to normal. Then one morning the suffering came too close to home. An article appeared in the LA Times on October 28, 1979, describing hundreds of children living in Skid Row hotels, the same vermin-infested, odorous hotels that I had visited as a social worker 10 years earlier. And by the way, in those days, if I found a child in a Skid Row hotel, it was called child endangerment. I was mandated to remove that child from the home. Not even 10 years later, our level of tolerance had so risen that it was accepted. The Skid Row area was just 20 minutes away from my house. Within a week, a woman possessed, I was again in the streets and hotels of Skid Row seeking a way to help. The result was Para los Niños, for the children, a child care center for 90 children from 6 weeks to 5 years of age, which we pulled from the streets, the alleys, and the decaying hotel rooms. And that was just the beginning. Para los Niños now occupies 3 large renovated warehouses in Skid Row with services including emergency food and shelter, child care programs, juvenile intervention and latchkey programs, parenting classes, health care, substance abuse programs, and individual and family counseling. More than 12,000 families, primarily single mothers with children, have benefited from our various programs over the years. Para los Niños could have been my life's work, and it would have been enough. But the families needed to move out of the area into decent neighborhoods and affordable housing. Unfortunately, it appeared that traditional low-income neighborhoods could no longer provide housing for those at the bottom rung of the ladder. And so, in 1983, I co-founded another nonprofit agency, LA Family Housing, to demonstrate models of affordable housing that would promote interest. I never considered myself a developer, but that would promote interest in building in low-income neighborhoods. The concept, however, of actually developing housing for people fascinated me, as I envisioned a social services component to help the families break the poverty cycle. And this is where reality began to clash with fantasy. Our first model project in South Central LA had a community garden, and one mother whom I designated as the child care provider for the other mothers so they could all go to work. I imagined that everybody would become one happy family, a sort of mini kibbutz of mutual support. Well, of course, the mothers wanted to arrange their own child care. Most preferred to buy their vegetables at the market, not grow them. And I soon had to realize that helping people did not mean gaining control over their lives. My first housing development, in fact, was a very humbling experience, as I came to realize that housing is a right, and being the creator of that housing did not give me the right to invade or direct the lives of the people living there. What slowly became apparent to me was that there were many fine lines in the work that we were doing, and that it would be a constant struggle to learn to balance and not to cross over those lines. What I learned was that I had a grave responsibility to respect at all times the basic human rights of all individuals, man, woman, and child. In 1985, my second husband died of cancer. A year later, I resigned as executive director of Para los Niños to become full-time executive director of LA Family Housing. That same year, we began developing shelters for families in response to increasing numbers of homeless families in Los Angeles, homeless men, women, and children spreading out all over LA County. During that first decade of homelessness, we optimistically thought that we were dealing with a temporary problem and that emergency shelters would be enough. In short time, however, we knew that we were wrong, and I found myself both witnessing and participating in the development of a new subclass in America, the homeless. In our misguided efforts to help, we were institutionalizing their plight and creating a growth industry around it. But something more was going on. Homelessness was just the most visible manifestation of increasing poverty in America. During the 1980s, we dug deep pits in communities throughout the country, and more people were falling in every day. The safety net was disappearing. The ladder had been taken away. I began to feel a growing sense of urgency, coupled with a deepening despair. It became obvious to me that our efforts were in fact doomed to failure, if indeed the numbers in need of help were so vastly greater than our resources. Developing affordable housing was not the answer because it took too long to build. I still like it when they're done, but it takes too long to build, and it would not begin to really help solve the problem for decades. It was apparent that more needed to be done. And this is where I began to look at things more creatively. Given a certain set of resources, how could they be put together in new and more effective ways? And so in 1988, I left my other work and began two new nonprofit agencies, A Community of Friends and the other Beyond Shelter. A Community of Friends was my response to the fact that nonprofit developers refused to build housing for people with chronic mental illness, and millions of dollars in special needs housing funds were not being utilized in California. In 1988, I created a nonprofit agency to utilize those funds, adapting the model I had been working with in family housing. Both through renovation and new construction, affordable housing would be developed in residential neighborhoods throughout LA County, not in Skid Row and not in inner cities. Each project would be developed in partnership with a local public or private mental health agency nearby, which would be committed to providing support, ongoing support and crisis intervention to tenants, primarily formerly homeless people, transitioned from the streets. Within 2 years, 2 model projects were completed, and a young urban planner from MIT moved from Boston and was hired as the agency's first executive director. Under his leadership, additional projects were developed, each providing support to tenants through collaborations with local agencies. Simultaneously, I must say, around the country, others in the field were creating similar models. At the same time that a community of friends was being formed, I was also creating Beyond Shelter to help homeless families out of the emergency shelter system and into permanent housing and residential neighborhoods. All I can say in defense, because the early stages of nonprofit creation are as stressful and risky as the startup of any private business venture, and starting two at exactly the same time was not the most intelligent thing I have ever done, is that once more, as with Para los Niños, I was compelled to act. By then, I had begun to appreciate the credibility my early work had given me, and I knew that I had the responsibility to continue that work in the direction that it was leading me, and continues to lead me. I don't know where. By the late 1980s, it had become very apparent that emergency shelters were unable to accommodate all those in need, forcing many homeless families to live in their cars in abandoned buildings, in rat-infested hotel, motel rooms, or doubled up with family or friends for long periods of time. Other families cycled in and out of shelters and transitional housing, sometimes moving into an apartment, but quite often losing it again. Without the longer-term support necessary, the longer-term individual support necessary to rebuild their lives, many of these families were becoming chronically homeless. Could I have a glass of water, please? Thank you. With the support of Dr. Margaret McKenzie, a former Vassar College professor who, by the way, obtained her master's at Harvard during the war, World War II, an innovative, which war? The one that they let women in. An innovative approach to the problem was envisioned, placing homeless families into permanent housing immediately, with supportive services provided after the move to help each family follow through on activities leading to social and/or economic self-sufficiency. This method would essentially bypass transitional housing and prolonged stays in shelters. This method would provide a direct means for homeless families to return to independent living while promoting each family's autonomy and dignity. With seed money from an anonymous donor, Beyond Shelter was incorporated in September 1988. Housing and social services staff were hired. Families, primarily 90% single mothers with children, raising their children alone, are referred to by battered women's shelters, homeless shelters, transitional housing, substance abuse programs, and churches. Since inception, since the first family was brought in, over 750 homeless families have successfully transitioned to new and stable lives in residential neighborhoods throughout LA County. Once in their own apartments, with the support of a case manager to assist them with child care and other issues, many have enrolled in school or job training programs, while others have quickly found employment. In 1994, this paradigm was adapted into the federal plan to end homelessness prepared by the Interagency Council on the Homeless. Because I like doing it, Beyond Shelter also develops, owns, and manages service-enriched affordable housing in inner-city neighborhoods. Developments consist primarily of 2, 3, and 4-bedroom apartments with classroom space and community rooms. At each site, a services coordinator assists families in crisis and helps all tenants access community resources and services. Residents participate in management and help to plan programs for children and adults. Coronado Place, a renovated former slum building near downtown LA, opened in 1992. Casa Carondelet is a nearby new construction project developed with a very partnership of a wealthy West Side church and synagogue. And nearby 130-unit Crescent Village apartments will include a child care center and micro enterprise project if I get the grant I'm writing. And I'm most excited right now about a project in South Central in construction just a few blocks from where the riots began called Umoja, or House of Unity, and I'm developing it in partnership with an African American church, Fannie Mae, and it's one of the first projects of the new AFL-CIO Housing Trust Fund. Beyond Shelter's Technical Assistance Department conducts annual national workshops both in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., provides consulting services to various governmental and private organizations nationwide, and publishes methodology manuals to help others adapt our innovative methodologies within their own communities. We are also part of the International Megacities Project for Innovation Transfer and have participated in the development and implementation of numerous demonstration projects for HHS and HUD. That's the work. Now how I feel about it. I have discovered over the years that the value of my work lies beyond the individual projects and the men, women, and children that they serve. Early on, I began to realize that I was in fact creating models for social change and that the work I was doing was research and experiment, resulting in new approaches to some real human problems. And since I could never find the time to go back to school, I was really happy that in 1992 I received an honorary doctorate in social science. But it was from Whittier College, Nixon's alma mater. But what good, really, are new ideas and new ways of looking at old ideas if the result is not social change on a massive scale? I realized before the last presidential election that I could not continue my work without some changes in Washington, and I therefore became politically active for the first time. Working with the Clinton campaign, both before and after the California primary, I served as a surrogate speaker on housing, homelessness, and welfare reform, and helped to coordinate a roundtable on housing and homelessness for the Clinton transition team. I then traveled to Washington, D.C. approximately 12 times in 18 months for a week each time, attending some subcommittee hearings when I could, trying desperately to learn how it all worked there, and participating eventually with various national advocacy groups on the development of policy recommendations for the White House. Invited to speak at national public forums, I made my points slowly and over and over and over again until they were heard. This spring, Beyond Shelter was honored to receive the 1996 Nonprofit Sector Award from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. At the same time, Beyond Shelter's Homeless Families program was chosen by HUD as one of the 25 best practices in the country to be presented in a best practices forum in Istanbul, Turkey in June at the Habitat II, the United Nations Conference, which I will attend. As a result of a third preparatory meeting for the conference held recently in New York, we are forming a steering committee to join with international human rights groups to promote housing as a human right in this country after the conference has ended. Which time do I have? Good, that'll do it. Because I feel so deeply that we all have responsibility to improve the world in which we live, one thing continues to bother me. When I first began doing this work, I tried to talk about it to friends, at social events, and so on. I discovered very quickly, however, that most people just didn't want to hear about it. Trying to understand over a period of time, I finally determined that my worldview had so expanded, that my knowledge base was by then so diverse from others in my circle, that there was no way for us to really communicate about those issues in any meaningful way. So I learned not to argue with people about poverty, welfare, and homelessness. Believe me, I could be a bore. But I have to ask, have we as a people become so overwhelmed by the problems that we have lost our passion for social justice? Or have mistrust and hatred, greed and selfishness so invaded our lives that we are unwilling to give of ourselves to others? Or has modern life become so complicated that we just have no time to give? I think I have learned over the years that most people really care. What I think has happened, however, is that our society has become so divided and fragmented that the average person no longer has contact with the issues. I believe that most of us have been truly segregated from the very real pain and suffering that exists in the world, because most of it is hidden. Or if we are aware of it, it is only through an antiseptic screening, such as television or newspaper and magazine articles. And I have become more concerned about these issues over the past few years as our society has divided itself increasingly into different camps, some of them armed, some of them in power in government and in the business world. We are in crisis, and it is important that we alert those in our society who care and that we educate them about the issues and that we break down the barriers that separate us from human suffering and human need. Only in that way will we be able to combat and then control and then diffuse the increasing mean-spiritedness in America. Last year, I was looking for new inspiration for a talk I had to give and found the copy of a speech given on the East Coast by a prominent rabbi at a national conference of Reformed Jews. Sent to me by the Social Action Committee of my temple, I had filed it away to read at a later time. At the end of the rabbi's speech were words as meaningful to me today as they were when I first spoke them at a forum in California many years previously. The rabbi quoted me with these words. He said, in the words of a Jewish woman, a social activist in California, most of the people in our world live heroic lives merely trying to survive for one more day. They are powerless to evoke change, let alone to help others. That is why I feel so strongly that those of us who can make things better must do so. And if we do not, we are depriving ourselves of perhaps the greatest opportunity life can offer to help change the world and in turn to give true meaning to our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, it's my honor to introduce Geraldine Jensen, and someone who I've known for quite a number of years, and it's been quite a wonderful association. Jerry started on her journey, I guess, when her husband left her and stopped sending child support payments, and that began an 8-year odyssey, an odyssey that I think many women have endured, and I'm sure Jerry has learned much more about it over time, of selling her home, going on welfare, getting a job, losing a job, getting sick, and being down to almost nothing. And apparently by 1984, it was $12. And she took $8.43 of that on a local ad in Toledo saying, not receiving child support, call me. Well, 25 women got together that day and they formed something called the Association for Children for the Enforcement of Support. Its mission was very clear, to assist children by ensuring that parents meet their legal, moral, and financial obligations, non-custodial parents. My association with Jerry started when we were on a panel together at the National Governors Association. She reminded me today of that event. And indeed, I think you can get some idea about Jerry's power by one important fact. One of the people on the panel that day was the current governor of the state of Michigan. And that governor is often talked about as a potential vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party and so forth. When Jerry was speaking, there were tears coming down from his eyes. She is someone who really does touch and make a difference. Beyond that, Jerry and I worked together in various ways on child support, and even to the point where I guess she held one of her meetings here at the Kennedy School in a room that I helped arrange. And then I went to the administration, and I learned the other side of social activists. I've had the opportunity on a number of occasions to testify before Jerry testified about what was wrong with my testimony. And indeed, Jerry has that remarkable ability to mobilize and make a difference and to listen, but ultimately to push you just a little further than you'd intended to be pushed. And ultimately, I think, has made a huge difference, and it continues even today. I mean, child support remains an area where we really are continuing to move forward, and I think there's a real chance of getting some extraordinary things through this Congress. So with that, there are a lot of important things to know about Jerry. The ACES now has 350 chapters in 47 states, 35,000 members. And indeed, she's been so successful that she has reached, I fear, the pinnacle of our society. And that is, she had a made-for-TV movie about her, which showed on ABC, called Abandoned and Deceived. With that, please help me welcome and honor Geraldine Jensen.
Thank you, David. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I've been looking forward to this. This award certainly inspires me to continue to work and fight for justice for the 29 million American children owed $35 billion in unpaid child support. I'd like to tell you how I got involved in the child support issue. I started out in a very traditional American family. We were probably almost like the Leave It to Beaver family. We had gotten married. We bought a starter home. My husband worked at the local factory. I worked part-time as a nurse's aide. We had 2 children, born 2 years apart, and we were supposed to live happily ever after. Unfortunately, like 50% of the families in America, we didn't, and we ended up with a divorce after 7 years of marriage. My sons were 2 and 4 at the time. I had a pretty typical divorce decree. I was the ex-wife, so I got the house. I also got the house payment. He was ordered to pay child support in the amount of $250 a month, given reasonable visitation, in order to provide health care for the boys. For the first 6 months after the divorce, all those things came true. He paid child support. He was there to visit and be with his sons on a regular basis. But then suddenly things began to change. The payments became farther and farther apart, and he wasn't visiting the children. And by 18 months, he had moved away and not left a forwarding address. Even though I had gone to work full-time as a nurse's aide to supplement the family income, I just didn't earn enough without the child support payments coming in. And pretty soon they began to turn the utilities off. And suddenly, Matt and Jake one day and I were homeless because the bank foreclosed on the mortgage. 48% of the single parents experience some type of housing crisis within the first year when the father leaves the home. We're often the hidden homeless. We were very fortunate. We didn't end up in a shelter on the street. We moved in with my mom and dad. They had just retired, and they were just very happy to have their daughter and the 3 and the 5-year-old move in. They helped us get an apartment, actually, and start over. And I got a little bit better job, but I was still having a very difficult time because I had 2 children in preschool, and half of my wages was going to daycare. So somebody told me there was this government child support agency, and I should go see them for help. So I did. I went in and I said, "Well, there's laws, aren't there, that you make people pay child support?" And they said, "Well, yes, but you have to know where he is. If you don't have an address, there's nothing we can do to help you. Why don't you go down the hall and sign up for welfare?" So I went down and talked to the people in the welfare department and filled out all the forms, to be promptly told that my $400 a month income was just too much, that we weren't eligible for any kind of help. And even though that was very sad in 1979, it's even sadder that if I was a single parent today in Toledo, Ohio with 2 children, and I made $400 a month, they would say to me, "I'm sorry, that's too much to get any help." She advised me that I should quit my job, and I'd be better off with the welfare check and Medicaid and food stamps. And I looked at her and I thought, I don't want a handout. I just want a little help. And so I'll get a second job. So I did. And 75% of the single parents report that at some point they've worked more than one job. I was working the 2 jobs, and about 8 months down the road, one night I was getting ready to go out to my evening job, and my youngest son, Jake, who then was 4, came up to me and grabbed me by the leg and said, "Mommy, Mommy, don't go." And I looked at Jake and looked into his eyes, and I realized that now he had no parent. He hadn't heard from his father in 2 years. I was never home, and I was getting nowhere. The more I was gone, the higher the daycare, and I gave up. And I quit my job, and I went on welfare. Now we were truly an American statistic, because 87% of the families on welfare are entitled to child support and don't receive payments. While I was on welfare, I went back to school. I was very lucky. I got to become a licensed practical nurse, and I had some hope I felt for the future. So I also was able to find out where the boy's father was living, and I gave that information to the child support agency, and they promptly said to me, "You can't get blood from a turnip. If you don't know where he works, we can't collect any support. So come back when you find that out." So I worked on that very diligently and talked to all of his relatives, and I finally found out that where he was working. And I went back to the child support agency and I said, "I really need the help. I'm getting out of school. I got this good job for a woman. I'm going to make $12,000 a year, but I still have to pay for daycare before and after school. And Jacob wants a baseball mitt, and Matthew has these ear infections, and this medicine is incredibly expensive. I really need these support payments." And they said, "Oh, it's an interstate case. He's in Nebraska. You're in Ohio. We'll mail the papers out there, but don't call us, we'll call you." So I thought, okay, I'll do it all. I'll work extra shifts as a nurse, and I'll just take care of everything. This time, I lasted 1.5 years. At that point, I think the worst thing that can happen to a single parent happened to me. I got sick, and I couldn't work, and I had no income. We had no savings, and we were back on welfare again. Except this time, I was really angry. And when I went into the child support agency, I was feeling, I've done everything you all say I should do. I got an education, I got a job, and it's still not working. You have to make him help. You have to make him hold up his end of the responsibility. He owes $12,000. It's been 7 years. You have his name, his address, his social security number, his place of employment. Do something. The young man working there looked at me and said, "I am so tired of you women coming in here and whining and complaining. If you think you can do a better job, go do it." Well, they hadn't done anything. I can do that. So I left the office that day, and I went over to the newspaper, and as David told you, I used part of my last $12 on the face of the earth to put an ad in the paper, and it said, "Not receiving your child support, call me." And the phone began to ring. 5 women called me who had been divorced and weren't receiving payments. 4 women called me who had never been married to the father and needed to establish paternity to collect payments. And 1 father called me who had custody of 5 children, and the mother hadn't paid in 3 years. We banded together and met later that week and formed this organization called ACES, the Association for Children for Enforcement and Support. The phones have not stopped ringing since that March 1984, and in fact we do have 350 chapters now in 47 states and 35,000 members. In the early days of organizing, We worked around the issue of it was wrong for a parent to financially and emotionally abandon their child, but it was just as wrong for the government to allow it to occur. When we were busy getting organized in 1984, Congress was busy passing the child support amendments. This law was supposed to end the problems of non-support. It required mandatory payroll deduction at 30 days of delinquency. It set up blood testing so that you could determine who the father was and establish paternity. Unfortunately, the results of that bill were very dismal, and they reported to Congress from the state agencies that they weren't able to enforce it because they couldn't find where the non-custodial parents worked. This was pretty amazing to us, considering that they've had access to the IRS, Social Security, tax and employment data since 1975. And it seemed obvious to us that they just weren't enforcing the laws. We began to organize chapters throughout Ohio and around the country. Our organizers are low-income single moms whose children are owed support, who are out there every day banding together and trying to change the world. We've found many things in our organizing. We found judges who say to us, it may be the federal law, it might be the state law, but I'm the law in this county. We organized an advocacy program to contradict this type of public official behavior. We have found a great deal of sexism. We have been told, what did you do to make him so mad that he won't pay child support? You went out and got yourself pregnant. What do you expect? It seems very obvious to us that the law enforcement system is victimizing the victim rather than tracking down the lawbreakers. We found a judge in Cincinnati, Ohio, who closed child support hearings to the public so he could take the mother behind closed doors and say to her, if you don't stop bringing this man in here and bothering him about this child support, I'm just going to take custody away from you and give it to the father. When we tried to gather evidence by monitoring the hearings to prove that this was going on, I was arrested for criminal trespassing in a public courtroom. We did go on to file a lawsuit in federal court and win, and open the court hearings in Cincinnati and across the country. Lately, we've been talking back to the members of Congress who sound a lot like that judge. Newt Gingrich's plan is a threat to low-income mothers to take their children away and put them in orphanages. The fathers' rights organizations say that if the father had custody, mothers would not need AFDC. Some women's organizations say to us, just work for pay equity. If you had that, you wouldn't need child support. Don't they understand that if women were still the sole support of the children, even with equal pay, it still would not be equity? Some liberals tell us there should be bigger welfare checks. That'll solve the problem. Are they not listening to us? Those who have been on welfare and are on welfare? We don't want a handout, we want a hand up. We want to be part of the American dream. Lately, we've been bombarded by those with traditional family values who say you just shouldn't get divorced or have babies when you're not married and bury their heads in the sand. Have they not noticed that the American family has changed? That 30% of all children are born to never married parents and 50% of families divorce? In the 1990s, 60% of the children born will spend part of their life in a single-parent household. I was appointed by Congress and President Bush to serve on the U.S. Commission of Interstate Child Support. Our job was to review the laws across the country and make recommendations. I quickly found that the best thing I could do as a member of that commission was to use the opportunity to organize ACES chapters throughout the country. And we brought parents in from everywhere to to argue and fight back against the attorneys and the judges and the county and state government associations who seem much more caring about the money they put in their own pockets for attempting to collect child support than for families who need those payments to feed and clothe and shelter their children. ACES has listened to thousands of non-custodial parents as they attempted to justify or reason why they don't pay child support. Many are fixated on their anger towards their ex rather than their legal and moral obligation to support their children. Maybe the reason people don't pay support is because we're a me society with little or no personal responsibility. Or maybe it's because we're a throwaway society and we throw away the wife and the kids and get a new set. Or maybe it's because we live in a society that accepts the premise that it's acceptable for a mother to work all day at one job and all night at another at minimum wage to support her family, but that real men don't work for those kind of low wages to support their families. Maybe it's because visitation is denied to fathers, yet the studies all show that only happens 12% of the time. Some people say it's because people don't have the money to pay their support. But again, the studies show that the average non-custodial parent earns $28,000 to $35,000 a year, and 80% still default on their child support obligation. 1 in every 6 children in this nation is a victim of this crime of non-support, and not just once, but every week, every month, and year after year. The main reason that this crime against children continues is because we do not enforce the law. If you think about it, how many people would voluntarily pay their light bill every month if the lights were never shut off? No matter the reason, it is important that parents begin to learn the importance of providing support for their children, and ACES is working hard to make sure that happens. We educate and empower parents to work through the legal system to collect support. We work to keep a constant pressure on the government to improve the child support enforcement system. And this can mean anything from testifying in front of Congress, meeting with President Clinton, to monitoring local court hearings to ensure that activities are properly carried out. We've been able to get the government to set up child support task forces in 23 states with ACES members and members of the government to work for improved enforcement. We successfully advocated for federal timeframes for government agencies to follow so that families can get their cases opened and processed in a reasonable time period. We worked for passage of the 1988 Family Support Act, which set up income withholding for child support at the time of divorce or establishment of paternity. And in 1992, we worked for passage of the Child Support Recovery Act, which makes it a federal crime to fail to support children in some interstate cases. ACES has filed and won lawsuits against Ohio judges and recently against the Texas Attorney General. We have built a network of community and child advocates to work together to solve this problem. We have been busy educating public officials through meetings and printed materials and even pickets of their office to make sure they understand the importance of child support. We have found that policy is always improved when the system listens to the victims of their help. ACES has made child support a front-page news story and brought it to the forefront of debates in Congress and its state legislature. Our public awareness program was so successful, 100,000 families contacted us last year for information and assistance. And often our national staff of 8 and our over 4,000 volunteers are overwhelmed by the sheer volume. But we keep on keeping on because ACES works. People working together, making the government listen and respond, helps our children. ACES child support collection rate for members is 75%. For government child support agencies, it's 20. ACEs will continue to educate parents about how to push their cases through the mounds of red tape and the bureaucracy until the time comes when the system works. This system can work. This is a social problem that we can solve. First, we need to set up an effective national collection system where state lines cannot be used to be barriers behind which non-payers hide. We need a child support collection system that is the same as collecting taxes through the IRS, where self-employed parents pay quarterly just like taxes. Children in America need to be as important as taxes. We need a simple administrative process to establish paternity and support orders. There is no need to force families into the often overburdened and ineffective criminal justice system to establish parenthood. We need a national guideline which is based on a parent's income and the number of children to determine the amount of support to be paid. We need to end a system that allows the parent with the most money to hire the most expensive attorney so they can pay the least amount of child support. We need a system that protects children from poverty while they wait for the slow wheels of justice to turn. A child support assurance program is needed. This would be like Social Security, which provides support for children when a parent dies. This system would guarantee a minimal child support payment for children living in a single-parent family who do not receive child support payments. The government could recover the support from the non-custodial parent. Children growing up in these single-parent families would be able to grow up seeing one of their parents go to work and learning that it is an important obligation for both parents to support their children. 29 million children are owed $35 billion in unpaid child support. Half live in poverty, in hopelessness and helplessness. Children are this nation's most precious natural resource. We need an effective national child support enforcement system they can depend on for protection and security. And by receiving this award, I want you to know that my inspiration has been renewed, and we will continue to fight for justice until every child has seen every penny of support their own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's immediately obvious why our two honorees today are here. It's truly extraordinary. I'd now like to introduce another person that says people are best judged by the deeds they do, and former business executive Ellen Gleitsman has set up an award, a series of awards actually, a foundation that recognizes and promotes social activism in a variety of ways. And I'll leave it to him to talk a little bit more about these awards and so on. But I think this is exactly the kind of important recognition that so often goes unrecognized. So let me introduce Ellen Gleitsman to present the awards.
I had read extensively about Tanya Tall and Gerry Jensen before tonight. But believe me, I had no idea of the strength and the depth of feeling and the emotion with which they carry on their daily work unless I was sitting here with you hearing them. Truly inspirational. I tip my hat to you. I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening to present the Gleitsman Citizen Activist Awards. And I'd like to particularly thank Joe Nye, Al Carnesal, David Elwood, and Bill Parent for their help. I'd also like to thank Sherry Roche, member of the Gleitsman Foundation Board of Directors, for her help on a daily basis. Standing here at the Kennedy School, I'm reminded how John Kennedy, at his inauguration some 35 years ago, issued a call to Americans to dedicate themselves to improving the quality of life for all its citizens. 5 years later, in a beautiful speech at Cape Town, South Africa, Robert Kennedy carried this theme one step further. He said, "Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events, and the total of those acts will be written the history of this generation." These words made a very strong impression upon me personally, and 10 years ago when I sold my business, they seemed to lay out the path that I should take. I created the Gleitsman Foundation in the belief that each of us, as individuals, has a responsibility not only to his family and his friends, but to the community in which he lives and works, and to the world whose resources we all share. It was obvious that our government was not able to cure many of the problems confronting us, and often it was only through the determined efforts of individuals like the ones we've heard tonight, and those that rallied to their cause, that important changes were being made. I thought by creating a series of awards that recognized activist achievement, we might bring confirmation and recognition to these courageous activists fighting for social change. I also hoped that by showing that the paradigm of activism does work, we might inspire others to take the first step in a new effort to cure many other problems facing us today. Tonight, we all sat and heard the dynamic, exciting stories of Tanya Tall and Geraldine Jensen. I wonder if the same thing struck you, but it struck me, how each of these women started completely without power. They had a burning spark within them, but they didn't have power in the conventional sense. And often I feel that many people say to themselves, well, this is just a terrible situation, and something must be done to change it. But really, what can I do? I'm struggling to support myself, to support my family. I'm going to school. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. And I can't fight City Hall. Well, you can. Remember the story. They're living proof that with hard work, courage, and continuing commitment, we can make a difference. And I think to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful if some here this evening took strength from the stories of these dynamic women and were encouraged to pursue their own activist dream? I'd like to return to Robert Kennedy's speech with the hope that you find it as inspirational as I do. He went on to say, "It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." Tanya Tall and Geraldine Jensen have started a ripple. As a matter of fact, each of them have really started a wave. And it is now my great pleasure to present to them the 1996 Citizen Activist Award. Please. Joe Nye.
Mary, you have to come over here so they can get you with the camera.
There's also another component to this award. Sorry, there's another component to this award. I would like to tell you a little about the sculpture, but there's a check for $50,000 to each of these women. That's my pleasure to present from the Gleitsman Foundation, Geraldine and Tanya. Just one other thing, I think you might be interested to know about the sculpture itself. This sculpture was created by Maya Lin, the creator of the Vietnam War Memorial. And her concept was, can you hold that up a little bit? No, so that they can see the face, right. Her concept was that there are people that see the world more clearly than other people. As a matter of fact, they see it almost in a magnified state. And it was with that thought in mind, she thought that this would be appropriate as an indication of the way these people acted their lives. I think that's only a part of it, though. In addition to seeing it, they worked at it, and they worked at it and worked at it, and that's the way things happen. So, congratulations.
It is the tradition at the Kennedy School to take advantage of having extraordinary people here to give people in the audience an opportunity to ask questions. It's also the tradition at the Kennedy School that people ask questions and not give speeches. So I would ask any of you who would like to ask a question or two. Our panelists and honorees have graciously agreed to answer questions if anyone has any.
My name is Leah Henry. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and this question is for Ms. Jensen. I've been one of these children that didn't have the support paid, but I've also been an employer and had to take deductions on some young men who were working actually for minimum wage. How do you feel about the way that sometimes the unfairness of this system forces a lot of young fathers particularly to try to stay out of the workforce in order to avoid being forced to pay more than they can reasonably afford?
There is a new federal law that sets up the amount of support that people pay based on their income. So if you were earning minimum wage, it would be a lower amount. But I guess one of the things that I always think of when people talk about it being unfair for young fathers to have to pay this money is we don't even think about the fact that the young mother might be working at McDonald's and providing well over the amount of support that the father's paying on a daily basis. And in fact, we expect her to do that, to be a good mother, that she's supposed to go out there and do that. And so I think that we need to begin to look at it for both sides, that both parents should be required to support. And that often means that parents have to make sacrifices.
I have two questions. Both of you can address either one. The first one is, in our real estate taxes, we pay a large portion to school children and schools. And I'm wondering why real estate taxes, especially if it's on a second home or a third home, etc. The problem with homeless people is basically we only have so much real estate. And so the people that have extra real estate, and even if you want to avoid companies in foreign countries, if they have moved their factories overseas and they're saving dollars there, still to contribute to a pool in the United States for property that's available for poor people to live affordably. That's just like we consider it a given that so much money goes for public schooling, why can't we consider it a given that so much goes for homeless people in a direct sense, not just through the efforts you're working for? And not to penalize people because they own real estate. It's the same thing that's sort of happening in the tobacco industry, where we're starting to penalize them for smoking, this kind of issue. The second issue I'm asking why we can't have is when you mention the power struggle between the poor women and the rich men having the attorneys, why can't we have a situation where, like Gideon fought from a prison cell for the right to legal representation that's in civil matters? And it doesn't have to be in every case, or it can be in a sliding scale case, but it's part of a mandate of the attorney field that so much time is allotted for if you've lost your arm, or if you're doing these kind of issues, or if you're against a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Gideon Goliath petition. Those are my two questions as to why we can't have this kind of, or do we have these kind of things going on?
Well, we actually do have a system right now that's federally funded that's supposed to provide a free attorney for a family who's owed support. Once you fill out an application at your government child support agency, you're supposed to get an attorney to represent you in court. Those people are part of the system that only collect on 20% of the cases. So it's not been effective.
And the money's getting cut for legal aid budgets.
Right. These are not legal aid attorneys, though. These are federally funded child support enforcement attorneys. It's just that the system has been very broken. Sometimes it's because they're overwhelmed. They have so many cases. Other places it's because they sign a contract out with the county attorney, who cares a lot more about people who steal cars than people who fail to support their children. So I think that the structure is there, but it does not work well.
Just be nice if we could percentage-wise make attorneys have to deal with so many things in this area.
I have a question for Ms. Tall. I was wondering, as you were speaking, you were talking about the classrooms and the new types of initiatives that are part of your housing projects, I guess for lack of a better term. And I was wondering how many people you employ, how many people from these places actually work with you. Do you have people who live in the buildings working in the classrooms? And I was wondering how that worked. How was your staffing in terms of people who live in these areas actually working with you?
I'll try to answer that simply by saying most of the families, the 750 homeless families that I have moved into permanent housing, it's not in my housing. I've moved in basically into better neighborhoods. Maybe 15 to 20 people have lived in housing that I've developed. Those are two separate endeavors that my organization is doing. So the 750 homeless families are living in West LA, they're living in the Valley, they're living in various suburbs of Los Angeles County. And caseworkers go out regularly visiting them for up to a year to help them connect to jobs, child care, job training in those neighborhoods. However, I will tell you that one of my finest employees is a former client, a woman who went through hell. She basically was a drug user on the streets, lost her children, had been employed, by the way, stable before she got into drugs. Her kids were taken away. She eventually pulled herself together to go through a residential drug treatment program for a year and got referred to our program from there, went to an substance abuse training program, got a certificate, and we decided to try her out when she graduated as a caseworker. She sits at a desk amongst all the caseworkers with bachelor's degrees and is the best caseworker we have. Her client caseload are women just like her. She's got her kids back. She's in an apartment. One daughter's in college in San Diego, and her life has changed. So in terms of the affordable housing that I developed, very briefly, this is developed as a model to demonstrate to both the private sector owners of low-income housing that may or may not be affordable in inner-city neighborhoods, rural and urban areas, and to the nonprofit developer and the organizations that provide support or should provide support services in communities to collaborate. And I demonstrate when I educate many different ways of providing housing and support to people living in that housing.
Hello, my name is Tina Perry. I'm a first year at the law school. And my question is for Jerry. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about just what work and activity you've done in D.C. with respect to child support in the last year. And also if you could just expand a little bit on child support assurance and tell us whether you feel like people in Washington are really accepting that idea and it's something we could see maybe really happen nationally in the next maybe 5 or even 10 years.
Thank you. We've been working on a bill in Congress that is co-sponsored by Lynn Woolsey, who is a Democrat from California, and Henry Hyde, who's a Republican from Illinois. And what the bill would do is to move child support enforcement into the IRS. And we now have 101 co-sponsors on the bill. We almost had it to the floor for a vote, but it was stopped at the last minute by the Republican leadership. But we're hoping that the bill can be revived if the welfare reform is completely stopped, or if they declare it dead, so to speak, then there's a chance that child support could move independently. So we're very hopeful there might still be a child support bill this year. With child support assurance, there was a lot of hope a few years ago. Congressman Tom Downey and Congressman Henry Hyde put a proposal forward for child support assurance to try to move it into a bill and to pass it. But there was quite a bit of controversy because it would be expensive. Some of the factions thought that it might encourage people not to get married. And so it's been a very controversial and a difficult issue to move. Lynn Woolsey did reintroduce a bill for child support assurance, and I would hope that if we actually get a child support collection system that works, so that there would just be a small amount of families who would need the government to pay the support for the father until they can collect it from the father, that we might have a chance of making it a reality in about 5 or 6 years.
Let me just also comment one thing on that score. This is an idea that I also care a lot about and worked hard for. In the Clinton administration welfare reform bill, there was a proposal for 3 or 4 statewide demonstrations of child support assurance. I think if the bill had passed, that would have passed. That bill ended the day the new Congress took over. Now, many of the child support provisions of the Clinton bill have been adopted in the House Republican bills, but this provision has been lost, and there is substantial opposition. But I think over the long run, it's an idea whose time may yet come.
Hi, this is a question for Ms. Tall. My name is Brad Cohn. I'm a second-year student at the college, and this last year I've been a supervisor and transitional counselor at this student-run shelter we have down the street. And this semester I started working with a guest who came in, and he was a couple $100s in debt. But he had a good job, and we started working on saving up some money. And he actually has 2 children, and he did pay child support. But gradually over time, over the last couple months, he's been able to save up some money. And so now is the exciting part. He started calling around, and we found an agency for him to work with in terms of finding housing at the level he could pay rent. And as he's gone from place to place, he's found that a lot of the places are really dilapidated. There's like bugs there and really worn down. One place he went, there was a hole in the wall. And I was wondering what could be done to either make landlords improve these kind of housing, or whether the government could subsidize. But at the level he's looking at, it seems like everywhere he goes, it's just really housing that he wouldn't want to live in.
Well, I can tell you what we did in Los Angeles. When I first started out, I didn't know where we could possibly find affordable housing because, there really wasn't any. This is why people were becoming homeless. I just felt that if we waited until it was built, these people would all be dead, decades later. And, we couldn't just keep developing shelters and transitional housing because we were, in fact, recycling people or working like you did with that man who's finally ready to get back into life. And how can you if you don't have a place to live? You can't. can't go find work, you can't do anything. So what we did at the beginning, I hired 2 people, my first staff. One was a social worker and the other was a housing relocation expert who had just moved 5,000 families out of a freeway corridor. I feel that housing is not a social services issue. It is a housing issue, and housing people know that issue. They work with management companies, landlords, development. It's 2 separate things. In everything I do, they overlap, but they're separate fields of expertise. And she went out after driving the streets herself at the beginning. To make a long story short, she found landlords that were willing to give our clients a chance and sometimes lower the rent in exchange for fixing up the place and painting it or mowing the lawn. She also started working with some of the housing management companies that had access to HUD units or Section 8 housing. It's very difficult with single people. This is partly why I worked with families and the mentally ill. I worked with who had enough entitlements at the beginning to enable me to access someplace for them to live. After 18 months, we went to HUD with the Housing Authority, the City of Los Angeles, and managed to get some 2,000 a year Section 8 certificates into the city for homeless families and disabled. No new ones this year. But what I can tell you happened after about a year and a half of placing families with management, in rental housing, management companies began to call us with units because they found that they were getting a screened tenant with a backup, not financial, but somebody who would help them transition and somebody they could call in a crisis. I'm sorry, it was brilliant. It worked. And to this day, we're getting faxed every single day, 20, 30 affordable units, single units for people. We run rental assistance programs and work right now all over LA County, all of the federal programs we're dealing with, including HOPWA, for 4058 programs, because we've developed an expertise. It's a housing department, housing resources department, with people who know how to talk the language. So you've got some work to do. You can do it, but he can't find it. You have to go help him right now. And then we have to get the government to get after those landlords and those absentee owners. It's a disgrace. It's horrible, and it shouldn't be.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Last question.
Hi, my name's Elaine, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. And my question is about accountability. It's clear that on a federal, state, and local level that the government is not being accountable to its social responsibilities, and that a lot of those social responsibilities are falling in the laps of communities basically community members. And I'm wondering how or what tactics have you thought about as far as holding the government accountable to many of its social responsibilities? And do you feel like you have any leverage to do so, or what kind of leverage would you need to acquire to do so? Because it seems like the situation that you're both in, while you're very successful at what you do, it's clear that financially, your budgets are probably limited, and that you need some sort of strong financial support to continue what you do.
My answer to that is voting. If all the poor people in the country, everybody over 18, if everybody voted in this next election, all women who were, well, okay, sorry, I'm not going to get into that. Kennedy School, okay. We have to have power in Congress. We have to be able to legislate appropriately, and we have to then be able to follow through. We can't have bills people work on forever, and then suddenly when they're finally passed, they're something different. What I've seen for years is funding from Washington going down a deep, dark hole. That's why I traveled there for 18 months. I figured out how it works and where it was going, and government needs people like Geraldine, people like me, people like our colleagues who are out in the streets walking and seeing what the needs are. And basically, solutions to problems that we have are coming from the communities in which they exist. And then what has to happen is we need to keep that conduit and that discussion open. I use the advocacy groups. She's an advocacy group. I use people like her dealing with housing and homelessness in Washington. And we've got very close, strong communication. And they're there and they're pounding and they're pounding and they're pounding away. And you just have to have the right people in Congress people in Washington to make sure that what you need gets done.
I would just like to add, I think organizing works, and early in my organizing phase, in 1986, they said to us, "You'll never make it a felony to fail to pay your child support in Ohio. It's impossible. You'll never get it passed." So we passed that one. Then in 1987, they said, "Oh, you'll never make it mandatory income withholding when people get a divorce or establish paternity." So in 1988, we got that passed. And we just keep moving forward and keep going. And we are holding the government accountable by working together. And there's so few people that actually take the time to write and call and visit their state elected officials and their Congress people, that if you get a group to do that, they do listen. And you can make them do the things that we need done. So organize.
Thanks.
Well, thanks to everyone, especially these two brilliant women, for thank you.